Since the end of the Civil War, there has been a debate over a topic of the Civil Rights Movement. In 1955, the modern Civil Rights era was started, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was anointed their leader. The Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 1960s in the United States was a movement to give blacks the same rights as whites in education and employment. It impacted everyone's lives. Dr. King's role was important to the movement, but what about the foot soldiers, the common man? Who had the bigger impact?
The law is there to uphold the human principle, that there is equal justice because we feel it in our hearts, that this is the law of our heart.
Reconstruction played a major role in the civil rights movement. Basically, this was a time period after the Civil War ended where people tried to get their lives back together. President Abraham Lincoln came up with this plan to reunite the Union and the Confederacy. One of the ways he got freedmen to work again was sharecropping. Sharecropping is when freedmen would farm land belonging to white owners or even their old masters. They would pay rent for the land they farmed by giving the landowner a percentage of their crops. However, this created a cycle of poverty. The blacks were constantly in debt because the white owners were never fair. The blacks were never able to earn a profit because all of the money they made was spent on the rent and other necessities. In addition to this, black codes were invented to prevent African Americans from voting, serving on juries, and other things that whites were allowed to do, which caused much fury. The South was practically in pieces. There were houses burned down, farms choked with weeds, and many poor people on the streets. Robert Smalls played an important role in Reconstruction. He was elected a member of the South Carolina House of Representatives from 1865 to 1870. Smalls was also selected to the United States House of Representatives, where he served from 1875 to 1879. During this time, he convinced President Lincoln to accept people of all color into the Army. Hiram Revels was also another important person in Reconstruction. He served as a senator of Mississippi in 1870 and 1871, which was during Reconstruction. He was the first African American to have this position. In the end, the result was that Reconstruction failed, and it did not help rebuild the Confederacy or bring the Union and the Confederacy together.
Martin Luther King Jr. was the person that most of America associated as the leader of the Civil Rights Movement, the man who made it all happen. Born on January 15, 1929, he was one of the most accomplished men of the 20th century. He was the first president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. He traveled thousands of miles and made over 208 speeches, all in the name of civil rights. In 1963, he led protests in Birmingham for desegregated department store facilities and fair hiring. His arrest and jailing for that was made famous in his letter from Birmingham jail. Then, in August 1963, he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in December 1964, and then in March 1965, Dr. King and about 3,200 people made the famous Bloody Sunday March from Selma to Montgomery. Dr. King is one civil rights leader that followed his beliefs and spoke out against segregation and equality. He not only spoke out so everyone should have equal rights no matter their race, but he also lived his message. He started protesting and assisted in organizing marches, protests, and other events to get more people to stand up against inequality and segregation.
The role of the foot soldiers had a dramatic impact on the civil rights movement. The common man, the foot soldiers, were the ones who played an active role in the overturning of segregation and the improving of African American voting rights. There was an incredible amount of segregation and racism against blacks in the South, but they fought it and took risks to get the freedom they deserved. For example, the Montgomery bus boycotts. An unknown foot soldier named Rosa Parks sparked the bus boycott when she was told to move to the colored section of the bus to make room for a white man. For this action of disobedience, she was put to jail. The action of this one foot soldier sparked the bus boycott and influenced African Americans not only in Montgomery, but throughout the United States. Even though it was Rosa Parks that started it, it took all of the people of Montgomery to carry it out. Another influential event was the Birmingham Children's March, initiated and organized by James Bevel, a march that Dr. King was originally against. On the day of the march, hundreds of teenagers showed up to march in protest of segregation. Friends of the children and young adults that were arrested joined the march, as well as parents and their extended families got involved. The same thing happened the next day, and eventually there were 1,000 children in jail. Bevel knew that when adults saw children marching and standing up for their rights, that older people would join this action. Even more importantly, Bevel knew that the sight of children being put in jail would dramatically stir the nation's conscience. People were appalled when local, national, and then international organizations covered this abuse on television. The Children's March's original goal was to desegregate downtown stores in Birmingham. Now, Dr. King had global stage and leverage to demand more. The Children's March began a series of events that made the Civil Rights Act possible. Footsoldiers also played a role in the lunch counter sit-ins in places like Greensboro and later Nashville. On February 2, 1960, there was a sit-in at the lunch counter of Woolworth's department. These nameless students risked arrest and abuse to end the segregation. Wire services picked up on the story, and civil rights organizations began to spread the word to other college campuses around the South. Gordon Carey, a representative from CORE, came down from New York to organize more sit-ins. The goal to desegregate lunch counters came from Footsoldiers, students, your average man looking for equality. Once again, the civil rights movement had shown that it wouldn't give in to white racism. The Footsoldiers had an enormous impact on the civil rights movement, and they carried out the intentions and beliefs of the leaders of the movement. All of these events and many others greatly helped the civil rights movement.
For every historical movement throughout mankind, you always had important leaders. However, the impact of the foot soldier, the common man, has a profound effect on history that is rarely written in history books. The foot soldiers of the civil rights movement made an impact on society outside and should be given the proper credit for their role in the civil rights movement next to great leaders like Dr. King. The foot soldiers impacted the civil rights movement because they took what the leaders said and they brought it back to their communities, actively resisting segregation and improving the rights of African Americans in the United States. Some famous foot soldiers include the Little Rock Nine. They were met with insults and threats and had to be protected by the 101st Airborne Division, but they successfully integrated the school. Another foot soldier was Viola Liuzzo. She was shot driving a few civil rights marchers back from a march. The Selma to Montgomery March was a major march that many foot soldiers took part in. After this, the president signed the voting bill. This bill protected blacks' rights to vote. Many a foot soldier became famous, but it still remained the unknown foot soldier that pushed the cause forward.
There are civil rights infringements and segregation throughout the world. For instance, in South Africa, there is a nationwide policy called apartheid. Apartheid started around 1948 when the National Party came into power and started to enforce the work of segregation laws. And leaders like Nelson Mandela, they forced the end of apartheid in the 1990s. By 1994, South Africa had democratic elections which were won by the African National Congress, electing Nelson Mandela as president. Since the beginning of 2011, there have been numerous uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. These movements are being led by foot soldiers of their respective movements. These people were tired of their corrupt and unjust government, taking away their civil rights. There was not just one leader in these countries leading their rebellions. It was a mass movement led by the common man, not an overall leader. The people wanted change, and for some countries, change happened quickly, like Egypt. But for others, like Libya, the people are deadlocked in a battle between the existing government and foot soldier of the revolution.
There is a point to each of the sides of the debate, because Martin Luther King Jr. was one who actually made all of the speeches to the public and was one of the first people to speak out about his beliefs and about protesting. But the foot soldiers were the ones who actually went out and did the marches and protests, because they got inspiration from Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches. If not for both Martin Luther King Jr. and the foot soldiers, the civil rights movement would not have been successful or made that big of an impact. In conclusion, we know that though Dr. King and other leaders of the civil rights movement gave speeches and inspired rebellion, we think it was the foot soldiers that took what they said and applied it to actions.
There's a train a-comin'. You don't need no baggage, you just get on board. All you need is faith to hear the deed.